So quite often when I make these videos, I'm answering particular questions that have been asked. But in this case, it wasn't a particular question, it was rather something that has come up recently in a few conversations. I was in a conversation with a man who was in his late 60s, and he was saying that he needs to make sure that his spiritual practice isn't going to be a slow path. He doesn't know how much longer he's got left on this earth, so he wants to make sure that what he's doing is going to bring him to liberation as quickly as possible. And I was also in a conversation with another person who was in their late 20s. But even though they had plenty of time ahead of them, they also didn't want to waste any time. So they wanted to try to find the fastest possible route to enlightenment. Because of course we don't know, even if we're young, we don't know how much longer we've got in this lifetime. So this is a relevant question. It's not something that I mention too often because the process of enlightenment shouldn't be rushed. But at the same time, we don't want to be doing something in terms of spiritual practices that's going to take 10 lifetimes when we could be doing something that will lead to liberation in this lifetime. So that does raise the question, which spiritual practices are the most effective ones? But it also raises another question, which is the best order in which to introduce practices. The practice might be very effective for very advanced students, but it might be not particularly effective for people just starting out on the path. So on my own journey, I actually came to spirituality by reading a book on Buddhism when I was about 16 years old. And in that book there was a brief description of the Buddha's life story, and it said that the Buddha had left his palace, he became a wandering ascetic and sought after enlightenment, and he spent years in the forests performing severe penances, and eventually decided that that wasn't going to work, and then he started to sit down every day under a tree and meditate. And then after some time he became enlightened, and then he lived for the rest of his life in a state of peace and bliss. Well, the book didn't describe how he became enlightened other than he was meditating under a tree every day. So I thought that the Buddha had figured something out. I believed that the Buddha must have been contemplating things, thinking about things hard. He'd come to an understanding, and that understanding led him to live in a state of peace and bliss. And that makes sense. I was 16 years old. In the West we don't have a meditation tradition, or we didn't then, 40 years ago. We had Western philosophy, and philosophers thought about things, contemplated things. So I thought the Buddha must have done the same. And so my initial spiritual practice over the next few years took the same form. I would contemplate things, see if I could come to the same way of seeing the world that the Buddha had come to. But it didn't work. Just trying to understand intellectually what liberation is didn't work for me, and doesn't work for anybody else. So then I started to look more closely at the Buddhist scriptures, and I realized that actually what the Buddha had done was to enter quite deep states of samadhi, what they call jhana states in the Pali texts. And it was through entering these deep states of meditative absorption that he was then able to see the world in a different way and to see himself in a different way. And that's what led to his liberation. So I then started focusing on meditation, and I started entering very deep jhana states. What happened next was the awakening of kundalini. Very powerful energy started to awaken in my body, started to purify the energy channels, activate the chakras. And I realized that there was a relationship between the samadhi states and this process of inner purification. If I went deep into samadhi for long periods of time, the purification speeded up and became more powerful. I also started to realize that I could change the way the purification was happening by using pranayama techniques. I could speed up the process of purification using pranayama practices, and I could make it more stable. So I added pranayama to my practice, and that accelerated things greatly on my path. I also discovered the practice of samyama. This is the practice of releasing things into silence, releasing feelings into silence, or releasing intentions into silence. This is a practice that's discussed in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, which is a Sanskrit text about 2,000 years old. I also saw how that practice of samyama increased the process of purification in the channels and the chakras, because releasing things into silence, into a purifying body, creates ecstasy, and that ecstasy purifies the nadis and the chakras. And at the same time, I saw how the practice of samyama accelerates the process of liberation, because the process of liberation is 90% about letting things go into silence. And this was all happening over a period of about 20 years. And then as the inner purification was reaching some degree of fruition, I found that I was able to be in samadhi continuously. Inner silence was present continuously. And I was able to make use of practices called jnana yoga practices. These are the self-inquiry practices such as who am I, or neti neti, not this, not this, or affirmations, or direct perception of the reality of non-duality, so non-dual or Advaita practices. But only when I'd reached that stage where inner silence was present all the time was I able to actually benefit from those higher level practices. And these higher level practices lead us into an abiding state of unity and peace and bliss and love. So my advice would be, if someone's looking for the fastest way of reaching liberation, start out with meditation. Start out with meditation because it's important to develop a level of stability, a level of equanimity, a level of calmness and contentment. And that's important from the outset, because the transformations that take place in the body are powerful. They're emotionally disturbing, they're physically taxing at times, and it's important to have that stability in place. So I recommend meditation to start out, And then add pranayama. Add pranayama to give some control over the purification process and to accelerate the inner purification process. Then add samyama practice, and then finally, when you're ready, you can add self-inquiry practices and non-dual practices to the mix. And this is building up. This isn't start with this and then stop it, and start something else and then stop it. This is start with meditation, add pranayama, also add samyama, also add self-inquiry, also add Advaita practices. So you end up with everything going on at the same time. And I'll put links to all of these practices in the description below the video.